Hi, Jaspreet. Welcome to 11 Questions.
Hi, thank you for having me.
My first question for you is, of the many hats that you wear, is there a favorite that you have?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question to start with. Really good one. I don't know if favorite's the right word, but I think out of the three, I would say I'm an educator first. Because I think no matter what work I'm doing, whether it's the poetry, whether I'm teaching in a classroom, whether I'm writing a book, I feel all of them have a mission to educate just in different ways and different mediums. So I think I'm always an educator first. I think I'll always be a teacher first, and then figuring out new and interesting ways to educate. So yeah, I think I'd say educator.
I love that answer. I found you as a writer. So
Mm.
I want to know if you have always wanted to be a writer.
Oh yes, I think I've always been the biggest bookworm. I was always that kid having my head buried in a book. As soon as I could read, I was reading whatever I could find around the house. My dad also is an avid reader as well, so we would have history books, science books, atlases, maps, loads of different forms of literature, fiction, non-fiction, lying around the house. So as soon as I could read, I was just picking up everything I could find, newspapers, magazines. So I've always been an avid reader and a big bookworm. And my dad used to take us to the library once a week. And I used to take out as many books as I could and carry them all home and read them within the week so I could get some more the following week. So I've always been in awe of authors. I've really looked up to authors, especially when I'd see names that sounded like mine or looked like Asian authors. I was always so drawn to that. So I think I've known for a long time I always wanted to write a book, but it took me much later on in life to figure out exactly what that would be.
How did poetry come into play?
Poetry came into my life when I was about 13, 14 years old. I'd been studying poetry in school, as many of us do within our English lessons at school, but I started writing my own poetry as a form of therapy, really. I was using it as a way to navigate a lot of the for thousands of years. So it's definitely a big part of our identity, our history, our heritage. And I guess I feel really, really happy seeing it really being kind of nurtured again in the current generation of young South Asians across the globe, bringing back this element of poetry in new and exciting ways. So I know when people see poetry, they think, okay, how does it work? How do you start writing? But I always tell people never to worry too much about making it sound poetic. I think people get caught up in trying to make it sound very flowery and romantic and all these things about poetry. But I always say that poetry is allowing yourself to be vulnerable with the page, and not to get too caught up in all those poetic devices and techniques, but just let whatever's within you flow onto the page, and you'll find that it can turn into poetry.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for anyone who's listening and wants to write poetry. Because I, to the day, think that it should rhyme at some point,
Yeah,
which is
that's
not how
a
it
big
is. But
a big misconception. That does it need to rhyme? Does it have to have rhyming couplets? Does it have to be written in verses and stanzas? And I think everyone finds those devices and techniques a barrier to get started. So I always tell people, forget all of that, just get a pen, start writing, and just see what comes to you. And before you know it, you'll start forming poems, even if you thought you never could.
and now you have written a book, Brown Girl Like Me. But before I get into the book, what's your favorite thing about brown culture?
Oh, my favorite. Oh, there's so much. I'm gonna have to say food because that's the first thing that came to me, and I feel that is probably the best answer. As a writer, I should probably say the books, the literature, the poetry, but I think one of the best things has to be our food. I'm a
There's no
big
argument
foodie.
over there.
There's no, yeah, I don't think anyone's going to debate me on this. So I think my answer has to be food. I'm a big foodie, and I think the food from South Asia is just so delicious and so diverse, depending on where you are and where you come from. And even within certain regions, you'll have so many different cuisines going on. So I think, yeah, it has to be food.
And did brown culture influence your book and your work in general?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think for the book, it was a huge influence. I think it was one of the leading factors that what led me to write this book was my brown identity and brown culture was something that I wanted to feel proud of. It was something I wanted to explore a lot more, especially the fact that I may have been brought up in the Western world and born and raised in the UK, but my brown culture, my brown identity is still a huge part of who I am. And sadly, there was times within my life where I wanted to deny myself from my heritage and deny myself from my culture. And I think that's something that a lot of us in the diaspora have gone through, that initially when we're much younger, when we're little, we're surrounded by our culture and identity. I remember I could only speak Punjabi till I was about 4 years old and started school. It was still a huge part of who I was. But then as I got to kind of a teenage age, I remember feeling a little bit embarrassed by it, not wanting to be that attached to my culture, because I thought to be cool and to fit in, I needed to come closer to whiteness. So there was a time in my life where I was denying myself from so many of the beautiful things that are a part of our cultures. But as I got older and into my 20s, that's when I first started to realize that okay, there's a huge part of me that feels like it's missing and I'm not nurturing in myself enough. I want to learn about who I am, where I've come from, and listen to the stories of my parents, my grandparents, and really understand who I am. And I think that's when I started to really navigate that cultural journey of understanding where I've come from, where and where I'm going. And that was something I wanted to bring out in this book, that even if you are born and raised in the Western world, or you've migrated to the West and you're navigating these different parts of your intersectional identity, you can still feel pride in who you are and where you've come from. And that's definitely what I wanted to show in this book, that there's so much within our culture, our heritage, our histories, that I want us to lean into and to find a sense of empowerment from. Because especially in kind of the feminist space, which is kind of where my academic background also goes into, I did a master's in gender studies and really wanted to look into why is it within the feminist space, many South Asian women are not sure where they belong in those spaces, even though feminist ideals and feminist culture has been a big part of Asian history. When we look at it from a lens of white feminism, often what would happen is that white feminists would be telling Asian women that if they wanted to be strong, independent, fierce, feminist women, that they would need to leave their faith, culture, identity behind. Whereas real feminism, intersectional feminism, which is definitely what we need to see much more of, is saying that you can bring your whole self to the table and you can still be a feminist, strong, independent, fierce woman. So that was definitely something I wanted to really convey in the book as well.
And why did you write this book?
Why did I write it? I guess my main answer to that question, there's a number of different reasons for why I decided to write this book. There was the anger, the frustration, the tiredness of feeling like Asian women weren't being represented in the way that I saw them. For a long time, I felt that the Asian woman's voice was really missing when it came to us telling our own stories. So often people were telling our story for us or on our behalf. And I felt there was so little of it coming from us, and a real sense of erasure. But I think one of the main reasons I wrote this book was really because it was the book that I wish I had growing up. It's the book I wish it existed. And if I had a book like this, and we're calling it a toolkit, a guidebook, a manifesto, I think if I had this book growing up, I would have maybe not made as many of the mistakes that I ended up making, or perhaps I would have felt a lot more confident in myself much sooner. And I would have known how to navigate certain situations within the school, within the workplace, within the home. I would have known how to navigate those things much sooner. So it really is a book I wish existed growing up. And I think that definitely is the main reason why I wrote it. So many other girls and many other women like myself never have to feel those feelings ever again.
When you were writing, did you follow a routine?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I guess I did have a bit of a routine with my writing process. And I guess this is something that lots of writers would definitely resonate with, that when it came to a book like this, which is a narrative nonfiction, my process of writing the book was a sense of a routine of taking time to research. And that would be in a number of different ways: reading academic texts, journals, researching in archives, reading both fiction, nonfiction, and then the interview process. I interviewed about 150 women for this book, so interviewing other South Asian women from across the country. And then taking time to sit there and write, and collating all that evidence together and writing it into these chapters, then proofing, editing, till I got to the final point of it being complete. So I guess that was the writing process as a whole, and the routine that I took for each chapter. But on a daily basis, there was a bit of a routine as well. I would say I'm quite an organized person. I guess that's the teacher in me that's quite organized. So I would have quite a strict routine every day, which would start with a morning walk, because I've got a big doggy whose name is Hida. So Hida would get us out every morning on a good 1 hour walk. And then I'd come back and meditate, try to work out if I could, have some breakfast, and then start my day. And then my day would then look like how I mentioned, that whole kind of writing process. And then by the evening, would try to get myself off the computer, no more screen time, and then try to relax within the evening. So during the 2 years of writing this book, day in, day out, that was kind of the routine I had. And considering it was during a worldwide pandemic and the whole world was in lockdown, I guess doing some of those things, making sure that I got outside, went for walks, meditated, spent time out in the garden, those things really did support my mental well-being whilst writing this book, because we were all dealing with a pandemic during the time that I did decide to write this book. Even though I had been researching and pulling ideas together for about 6-7 years, it was really at the start of 2020 when I sat down and started writing this book. And in March of that year, the whole world turned upside down. So I just kind of had to navigate that like many people had to, as it happened.
That definitely would have given you more time, though. No more social events.
Yeah, I had nowhere to go. I had no one to see. So I just had to write.
And was there something that you found challenging these 2 years?
I guess the pandemic was one. I didn't expect to be writing this book in those conditions. I was just about to start my research fellowship at Birkbeck University, and as a part of that fellowship, I was going to get my own office, and I was going to be in central London, right next to all the libraries and museums, and I imagined that was going to be the space that I write this book, and it was all very romantic. I kind of romanticized the whole idea in my head. And obviously the pandemic happened, and I was then working from home, and we set up a small desk in the corner of my bedroom. So it wasn't quite the way that I thought I was going to be writing this book. But in hindsight, when I look back at it now, and I've mentioned this in the afterword at the end of the book, I'm a big believer that everything happens for a reason. And I think that this book was meant to be written within the home. And it wasn't meant to be written in a fancy office in London, or in a kind of fancy writer's retreat in the countryside or anything like that. I think it was meant to be written in the home, because the home is really one of the most complex places that we as brown women have to navigate. There's a lot of different circumstances within the home that we have to go through, both positive and negative. And it can also be a haven as well. It can also be our safe space. It can also bring us much closer to who we really are. So I think this is where I was meant to write the book. I was meant to be at home. So yeah, even though that was definitely one of the hardest things at first, sitting in the corner of my bedroom now writing this book, I think in hindsight that it was meant to be that way. So that was probably one of the biggest challenges.
And if any of the listeners also want to write a book, what's a piece of advice you would share?
I guess if you want to write a book, and this is different from wanting to get it published, if you want to get it published, I think there's definitely a bit more advice on what I could say there. But if you want to just start writing a book, my best piece of advice is to give yourself an amount of time every day, whether that's 10 minutes, whether that's 30 minutes, whether that's an hour. I think the consistency of giving yourself that time every single day to write is really, really important. And even if nothing fruitful is coming out of that time, even if you're sitting there writing the same old paragraph over and over again, just getting in that flow and that consistency, I think is one of the best pieces of advice that I was given. And there's a really great book on this. It's called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And what she recommends is you take this time to free write every day. If you can, try and do it at the start of your day, before you get distracted by emails and everything else coming through. Just take that time to free write every day. And I found that sometimes that's when my best ideas come to me. So yeah, if you do want to write a book, give yourself that dedicated time every day, because that's what you deserve. And that's what your piece of writing or your book deserves. And try to be consistent with it.
And now here's a question for the bookworm in you. If you were to be deserted on an island, which three
Okay.
books would you take with you?
Oh my God. Three. Okay. Oh, it would have to be, one of them would have to be a book by Bell Hooks, who sadly passed away recently. She was one of my biggest inspirations as an educator, as a writer. I'd say her book, All About Love, is something that I look back to time and time again when I need to remind myself of how I want to love and how I wish to be loved. So that's definitely one of them. Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, I'm a huge fan of. Obviously, it's a beautiful book. I think the way it's been written is truly just something that I've never seen before. So God of Small Things. And then, oh, what would my third one be? I would have to say something poetic. So maybe a poetry book by another South Asian woman, just from the top of my head, Jaspreet Kaur, from Canada. Her pieces of poetry are absolutely stunning. Rupi Kaur being obviously now a household name across the world. So maybe a piece of poetry collection from one of my South Asian sisters would probably be the third one.
And for our last question, if you were to pick one interesting life experience to share with us today, what would you tell us?
An interesting life experience. Ooh. I was very fortunate enough to take a year out to travel shortly after I got married. So my husband and I decided not to have a big Indian wedding for Indian standards. We decided to have a small wedding by our first home, and we decided to, instead of put that money towards a big wedding, we actually went traveling for 12 months. So we
I love
went
that.
backpacking.
That's so smart.
It's so smart, and definitely something I recommend for everybody. I know it's everybody's personal opinion on how you would like to celebrate your own marriage or wedding, but we decided to put that money towards traveling. So we went backpacking around Asia for 6 months, and then through Africa for 6 months. Both parts of those trips were absolutely incredible. I'd always wanted to travel to Japan and Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam. But I think the second leg of the trip, when we were camping through Africa, we started from Cape Town in South Africa. We went up the western coast into Central Africa, and then up the eastern coast, all the way up to Uganda. That trip specifically was just a really spiritual time for me, because we were camping the whole way, no electronic devices, no Wi-Fi. We were away from most civilization, especially when we were camping out in the middle of like the Namibian desert. We of course went to some city areas as well, but I think when we were camping out in very rural areas, we were away from lots of civilization. We were just kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I think that was a really eye-opening experience for me, that since I got back from that trip, I would like to say I've been living a bit more frugally, less attached to material things, because on that trip you could only carry with what you could have on your back, and that would be one backpack. I had an 18-liter backpack, and I could literally only carry what would fit in that bag, and the heavier it was, the more difficult it was for me to carry. And it taught me a really important lesson both physically and metaphorically, that the more you carry with you, the more baggage you end up having. And sometimes that baggage isn't always good for you. So to let go of the things that no longer serve you is something that I'll always hold with me. So I think that trip really did change my life.
That's so beautiful and poetic. I love that. Well, thank you, Jaspreet, for answering all my questions and for being a guest on my podcast. It was so great talking to you. I always love speaking to brown women doing amazing things. But before I let you go, one last thing. Would you want to tell our listeners if they want to buy your book, how can they do that?
Absolutely. If you'd like to grab a copy of Brown Girl Like Me, if you head to www.browngirllikeme.com, you'll find all the retailers that have the book available. So it'd be amazing if you could purchase a copy, give it to your friends, give it to your aunties, give it to your sisters, your nieces, anyone you feel this book can help. That would be incredible. Thank you.